Great. I think we're going to get started. So welcome everyone to our, I think this is our 5th or 6th weekly policy meeting for the Our Salem project. Today we're going to be talking about natural resources and the environment. I'm Eunice Kim, the Long Range Planning Manager for the City of Salem. And I wanted to let all the other staff members here introduce themselves. Patricia, Austin, Jennifer, Greg, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Patricia Farrell. I'm the Parks and Natural Resources Planning Manager.
I'm Austin Ross. I'm a long-range planner with the City of Salem.
Hi, I'm Greg Walsh from the City of Salem Emergency Manager.
And I'm Jennifer Mongolo, Natural Resources Planner working with Patricia.
Did I see Glenn Davis pop on? I may have. Oh.
Yes, I'm Glenn Davis. I'm the Floodplain Administrator and Chief Development Engineer. Not in that order.
Great. So thank you so much for joining us today. Just as a reminder, we are live on YouTube and we are keeping track of the chat, and we will be posting the chat online on the project page for everyone to see afterwards. So just have an FYI. So again, I'm Eunice, and we're here today to talk about natural resources and the environment. But I'm going to start with just a quick project overview of the Our Salem project, kind of where we are and what we're doing. And then I'm going to walk through kind of 3 different sections of today's meeting. The first section is really going to be about policies that we have previously drafted throughout the kind of visioning process. So that was the last 1.5 years, 2 years of work that you may have seen in our vision document. The second portion is really going to be new policy ideas that staff across the city have researched in other communities' comprehensive plans and trying to figure out, are those policies that make sense for Salem? And then we're going to really open it up for your questions and ideas. If you have questions throughout, feel free to drop it in the chat and we'll address them as we go. So just as a reminder, this is the Our Salem project. It's a multi-year project to update our comprehensive plan. This is a document that includes high-level goals, policies, and a map that really guide how we grow and develop over the next 10, 20, 30 years. It influences everything from where different types of businesses are allowed, where different types of housing are allowed, what are impacts of that built environment on the natural resources in the environment, our topic today. Also influences our park system, our transportation system. So it's really that high level framework that is going to help us guide all of the growth that's happening in the Salem area. And this is a map of the Salem area. The black dashed outline is city limits, and the gray area is the area we're planning for. So we're planning for not only city limits, but also the unincorporated areas of Marion and Polk County that are within what we call the urban growth boundary, our portion of the urban growth boundary. So this is the red boundary you see that really is meant to contain development within there so that we can preserve the farm and forest land on the outside. This gray area is the area where people, if you hear them talking about 60,000 more people living here by 2035, they're referring to this gray area, not just our city limits. And so this is the area we're trying to proactively plan for. So where are we in this project? We've been working on this project, I think, 2 or 3 years now, and we hit a major milestone in March where we brought all of the kind of high-level ideas that we've heard from the community, rolled them into goals, and then a proposed comprehensive plan map. And we put that together with the help of our consultant team in a vision document that we brought to the City Council. At that time, we really asked City Council, will you accept this vision? It was an adoption process, but more of an acceptance to say, are we headed in the right direction? Is this the framework in terms of goals and a map that we want to pursue as we work on details? So there's a lot of details of this project. They did accept the vision, and so now we're working on all those details. Those details include the zoning code. So those are the regulations that really dictate kind of what you can and can't do on your property, what development looks like, as well as the zoning map, which I'll talk about later, and then the policies. These are the more detailed ideas that we would put in our comprehensive plan that, again, guide our growth and development in the future. So today's all about policies. So I guess this is our 6th meeting, our weekly meeting. We've talked about a lot of topics already: transportation, housing, economic development. And again, today is natural resources and the environment. We had a placeholder meeting on May 19th for any topic that we may have missed or we wanted to circle back to. But since we've launched our interactive map, which I'll talk about later, we're changing that meeting on May 19th to really be a public forum where we can answer questions about proposed zoning changes on the map. So I will talk a little bit more about that later. But these meetings we've been holding twice every Wednesday at noon and at 5. We have the same topic and the same kind of information at each meeting. You can join us at either one or at both if you'd like. So if you want to join us at 5:30, we'll be here. So the 3 sections of the meeting today, again, for each section, we're going to present different policy ideas that we've heard in the community or that we've looked at and found in other cities' comprehensive plans. We'll present those ideas, kind of give examples and explain them. And then we're going to do some live polling and ask for your input. You can do that via text or via web. And so I'll explain that in a little bit. And then again, if you have questions anytime, feel free to put those in the chat. So some of you, I think, maybe have joined us in previous policy meetings, but for those of you who are new, welcome. We are doing an example poll of how you can do this interactive voting. So if you have a web browser, you can go to pollev.com/ekim847. So this is actually changed from the last time we did this or the previous times. So it's a different link. And then, or you can text ekim847 to 22333. And we're going to try it out. So it's anonymous and those questions should change automatically. So if you're using a web browser, every time we get to a new question, it should refresh on your page. And then if you're using your phone, when you text ekim847 to the number 22333, it should welcome you to our session. So we're going to give it a shot. Let me see if I can. So working. If you have questions or it's not working, just let us know or drop in the chat. Austin, how many folks are we thinking?
It looks like we should have about 18 responses if everybody in this session is participating, but we could have people watching live on YouTube who vote as well.
All right. Okay. I'm going to put the link in the chat. Hopefully that works. Let me know. EM, I put the link in the chat. I should try. So it looks like there's a question here about, oh no, comment. I would like the meeting on May 19th to focus on coordinating our Salem with the Climate Action Plan. We can certainly talk about that today. I think there's going to be a lot of overlap, as you'll see. And we can talk more about that also at the next meeting. We're going to try to reserve that May 19th meeting, though, to really focus on the map, as we've gotten a lot of questions on the proposed zoning changes that we'd like to be able to talk about and hear people's concerns. And if we need another meeting, we can always add a meeting. How are we doing, Austin? You said 18?
Yeah, and we just had one more person join, so maybe if we could drop the link in the chat again, that would be helpful.
Okay.
If anybody's having troubles, feel free to share a message in the chat or message one of us directly, and we'll do our best to help troubleshoot.
Let's write it again. 1 second. 847. Is everyone able to get in? Might give it one more minute. And Patricia, I don't know if you wanted to address that. I'm sorry, I just kind of jumped in on the May 19th meeting about coordination with the Climate Action Plan. Is there anything you wanted to add?
Well, there is a lot of overlap, and I'll try to tie that together at least as much as possible when I'm talking about natural resources, because that is definitely one of the things that is important for the Climate Action Plan as well. But there are overlaps between the two plans. So Eunice, it's going to be kind of up to you how you want to manage the next meetings.
Sounds good. Great. So someone's connected through the texting. So I think maybe we'll try to move on, and then if we have questions when we get to the polling, let us know. So speaking of other plans like the Climate Action Plan, there's a lot of planning efforts that are going on in the city right now and just generally. The biggest one that we are definitely coordinating with is the Climate Action Plan. There's a lot of work being done with Patricia and across the city and the community on looking at how we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions as well as make the community more resilient. And so a lot of those topics and strategies will be incorporated into our Salem project as that kind of moves forward. We're coordinating on an ongoing basis, and so Patricia will talk a little bit about that today, and I'm happy to answer questions if there's specific questions. There's the Salem Strategic Plan, which was updated and adopted by the council, I think a couple months ago as well, that talks specifically about climate change and the environment. There's a lot of master planning that has been happening in recent years in terms of specific parks. And so that is something that happens when there's a specific site and the parks, they do a master plan to really understand like what should be in that park, what should that park development look like. We've talked a little bit about that last week when we talked about parks and recreation, but there's obviously overlap. And then there's a community forestry strategic plan, and there's an urban forestry, urban canopy goal as well. I think it's 28%. Is that right, Patricia? That we have as well as we look to kind of grow our urban.
Yes.
canopy.
Our new goal is 28% over the next 10 years.
Fantastic. So there's a lot going on. We're coordinating across the city, so we will continue to do that. Looks like there's a question. Is it possible to download the presentation slides? Yeah, we can PDF them and put them on our project website. Or are you talking about right now? There's a question in the chat. At some point, yes. Okay, we can look to do that as well. Do you want to move on? Oh, thanks, Austin. So this is our vision statement that was included in the vision document we brought to council in March, and it really represents shared priorities that we heard throughout the visioning process in Salem. And one of the things that was definitely an emphasis in our outreach and in our vision statement here is really protecting open spaces in the environment and really valuing that. So I just wanted to put that there because a lot of our goals and our policies as we continue working on them will support this vision statement. So we have a lot of goals related to natural resources and the environment in the comprehensive plan vision document that we brought to council. And I just want to touch on them. You'll see that they're very high level. And the goal of today is really to get to the details of what do these mean and how do we accomplish them. We have one generally about protecting the environment, so our natural resources, our ecosystems, and the environment. We have one specifically on greenhouse gas emissions. This was something that we updated after the council adopted the goal of the city being carbon neutral by 2050. So you'll see that in the plan. And then we have a broad goal around urban forest. So this is what I was talking about, our tree canopy. Trees have been a priority. It's brought up a lot in our conversations. And so we wanted to make sure we had a goal specific to our urban forest. And then we have one on design and development, as well as natural hazards and resiliency. So we're going to kind of talk through specific ideas along all of these topics today. And I think Austin's going to kick it off first with some of our previously developed policies. Go ahead, Austin.
Thanks, Eunice. So as Eunice mentioned, we're going to start with some policies that were drafted previously. Those were shared in the vision document that was accepted by council. And those policy ideas came from outreach that we had done previously in the project. So after working with the community for 2 to 3 years already, we had a lot of ideas that we wanted to make sure we got down on paper and shared. So those were in the vision document, but we also want to make sure that we give those a chance for the community to test them. It's important to remember that we're testing the ideas, not the verbiage. So you'll notice that these ideas were even summarized from the vision document. And so we're not trying to wordsmith, we're just trying to ask, are these ideas that you like? Should we be carrying them forward? So it's also important to remember that this is a small sample of all the policy ideas that we have. Right now we have, I think, more than 100, maybe even 200 policy ideas that we're considering. And we would definitely encourage you to go check out the project website if you wanted to look at all of those. But these are ones that we thought it was important to share and important to test with you all. So the last important thing to understand is how we're using some of the language in these policy ideas. So there are some policy ideas that say things like encourage or promote, and that refers primarily to incentives rather than a mandate or a requirement. If you see something, words like require, then that would be something that the city might be considering mandating. So just to make sure that we're all clear on what these policies imply is important. So we'll start with the first set. We're going to go through these kind of in groups. And if you have questions about the intent of the policy or what it's getting at, as well as questions about using the live polling as we go, feel free to drop them in the chat. So this first group of policy ideas is about environmental protection. And that one about natural resource protection is just protecting the quality and function of all our natural resources. So whether they are related to habitat or clean air, clean water, things like that, just generally making it a priority to protect those things. The one about air quality is more specific to preserving our air quality through things like green infrastructure, reducing impervious surfaces, and making sure that we're doing as much as we can to make sure that we have clean air in the city. The one about riparian areas is specific to protecting trees and native vegetation near waterways. So whether that's protecting what's there or helping to restore potentially degraded corridors. And then the last one is about protecting and dedicating more natural open space. So whether that means leaving portions of parks more natural and less developed, or just preserving open spaces generally as open spaces. So we're going to jump over to the poll now, and you can vote for as many of these as you'd like. It's just asking, do you like these ideas? So you can vote for all of them or just a few, whatever you feel is appropriate. And while people are voting, I'm going to jump back over to the list of ideas that we're testing just so that you can keep them fresh in your mind. So if anybody has questions or thoughts about these, feel free to drop them in the chat there. I think we maybe even had a couple more people join. So it might be, yeah, so somebody's asking, how do I vote on the computer? So you can see at the top of the screen here, there's a link you can type into your web browser, pollev.com/ekim847. Type that into your browser, either on your computer or on your phone, and it should take you to the polling. Maybe Eunice can drop that in the chat again. There it goes. So yeah, please do join if you're able to. Just a little bit longer so some of the folks who just got onto the call can keep voting. And like I said, if you need clarification about what any of these mean, let us know. So there's a question asking, what about diesel emissions and fine particulate from truck traffic throughout the city? I think that's an important point. It's definitely something to consider. We don't have a policy specific to that yet, I don't think, but it's definitely included in air quality. And things like vegetated buffers next to major streets, things like that can help with that sort of thing. So yeah, that's a good comment. Somebody suggesting that there are other better ways to improve air quality than those that are listed here. That's also possible. Patricia, do you want to speak maybe to why these specific ones are in this policy?
Sure. Well, I mean, air quality is kind of a tough one because it's technically under Department of Environmental Quality as far as monitoring and at determining if it needs, if we're in a pollution, I can't remember the exact term, of air quality coverage area. And so this is related to how do we use natural resources to improve air quality. So if you have other ideas about how natural resources can help improve air quality, please let us know. These vegetated buffers and tree planting was one way, and then reducing impervious surfaces was more related to actually to temperature probably than to pollution.
All right, thanks. So somebody's suggesting reducing pollution is a good way to improve air quality. That makes sense too. Another comment saying the Meyer Farm Parks and Open Space is a 29-acre open space. Large group is working on saving. It will be an important amenity to provide relief from needed increase in housing densities. When is the appropriate time to inject this element of preserved open space into the discussion? I think you just did. So thank you. I appreciate that.
And you can also do so on the interactive map that we'll talk about in a little bit.
Sure. And I think maybe we talked about that at the parks meeting as well. Siting of industrial properties is an element of our environmental justice, and it does affect air quality as well. So thank you for that. How heavily are these weighted in zoning plans? Eunice, do you want to maybe speak to that?
Sure. So as we kind of look at, for example, buffers, riparian buffers, one of the things that we could do either as part of this project or implementation, if policies move forward to, for example, have bigger buffers, we would make that it would be like a code change. So we would require maybe a wider buffer along our creeks or further restrict uses. So that's kind of part of the conversation of if that's something that the city wants to move forward with, the community does, could we implement that through a code update?
I would also say that just more generally, these policies are, intended to be citywide for the next 20 to 30 years. And so they do trickle down to other plans that the city implements and produces and the zoning as well. So there's some prioritization and some push and pull between different policies and priorities. And so they do all carry about the same weight, but the way in which we get to them is sometimes different. And then one other comment about Cleaner Air Oregon is probably going to show that the Covanta Marion incinerator is a major source of air pollution. All right.
I just wanted to add one more thing, Patricia, that, as far as the air quality, and this has come up in some of the climate action plan discussions, is using the actual building envelopes, for green walls or green roofs to also absorb pollution and cool the air around buildings. So that was another idea that's come up through the climate action plan.
Great, thanks.
And then there's a comment about pocket parks and linear parks. And I think we had discussed kind of having a potential policy about new types of parks, maybe infill with those pocket parks at our last meeting. And just as a reminder, there will be updates to both the transportation system plan and the parks comprehensive parks master plan after the Our Salem project to help move some of these ideas forward.
Great. I see one other comment about zoning in there, and we'll definitely have time to talk about zoning towards the end of the presentation. So let's move on to the next group. Some of these are about environmental protection still. Two of them are also about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So the first policy idea is related to brownfields, and those are lands that were potentially contaminated through previous uses or development. And so this policy would be about helping to assess and clean up remediate those brownfields so that they could be safely developed and used in the future. The environmental impacts policy is about reducing and mitigating the environmental impacts from city-funded programs and projects. So whether that's an infrastructure project or some other type of city program, making sure that we're doing what we can to minimize environmental impacts from that. The land use and transportation policy idea is about facilitating and making changes to land use patterns and transportation system to reduce emissions. So that could be related to making neighborhoods more walkable. It could be related to including more dense development closer to transit so that people can use that as a more viable option of getting around. But it's really about the interaction between how we use our land and transportation and how we can reduce emissions that way. And then the one about municipal operations is about prioritizing efforts and strategies that reduce emissions related to municipal operations and facilities. So whether that's efficiency of buildings that are owned by the city or the way we operate. So maybe making sure we have an efficient fleet of vehicles, things like that to reduce emissions that way and lead by example. So we'll jump over to the poll. Again, we're voting for all of them that you like. And I saw a lot of chat going on, so I'm gonna see if I can catch up with all of it.
There was a question about brownfields. I was wondering if Patricia
So I can just talk about that related to parks and natural resources. So for instance, Riverfront Park, is a former industrial site that is now a park. It has a cap on it because it had contamination. So we definitely look for brownfield sites for redevelopment and for natural areas. Minto, the conservation area we acquired at the north end, also has a cap over some contaminated areas because it also was industrial. So they are issues in Salem because there was a lot of industry, especially related to river development.
Awesome, thank you. I also just want to remind everybody that we are posting this chat on the project website after these meetings, and we're using all the information in the chat to help inform these decisions as we update these policy ideas and carry them forward. So just putting comments in the chat is a great way to make sure that your ideas are included. Comment, let's not forget that the landfill was located at Minto Brown for years. So yeah, that's a good point about brownfields and how we remediate those. Another example of a common type of brownfield could be places where there used to be a gas station, no longer operating as a gas station. And sometimes there's some ground contamination there that could be cleaned up. Comment about C being the most important to this person. Good to know, thanks. All right, well, I think we've had a good chance to vote, so why don't we move on to the next group? These ones are about the urban forest and natural hazards and resilience. So the first one about tree preservation is about increasing the quality and health of trees and stands of trees through our regulations, incentives, and more. So whether that's using our zoning code to make sure that we're preserving trees or other incentives to encourage people to do it on their own, that would be what that policy is about. The one about tree planting is about increasing our urban tree canopy through planting across the city, but particularly in areas where we currently have a low tree canopy. So our current tree canopy goal is sort of citywide, and this would maybe encourage us to look, to kind of break that down and look at where potentially there's lower tree canopy now and how we can work on increasing that in specific areas. The one about transportation infrastructure is about enhancing and identifying emergency transportation routes and regularly updating emergency plans. So that would be an effort to help make the city more resilient in case of a natural disaster, and make sure that we're ready to respond. And the one about seismic upgrades is about supporting efforts to make public and private buildings more resilient to seismic activity and other natural disasters as well. So that an example of that is the renovations of the library downtown to make them more make that building more seismically resilient, but also encouraging and looking at ways to incentivize the private building owners to do the same. So we'll jump to the poll on this one, and again, go check out the chat. I'll jump back to the ideas while we're talking about that stuff. So I see a comment saying, in addition to brownfields, there are lots of agricultural land around Salem. And when converted to residential use, there needs to be a policy in this to comply with DEQ guidance. I believe that's already state law. So I think that we would comply with all DEQ regulations already when development takes place, but correct me if I'm wrong.
I also added in there in the chat to everyone that when we acquire land for a park, we always do a phase 1 to see if there's any issues that we need to investigate further before purchasing the property.
Great, thanks. I see another comment about supporting the city going to electric vehicles. Somebody commenting that they've heard that there's still some contamination in certain areas, like Riverfront Park in Minto, that could be getting into the river. So it's a valid comment.
Just on, can I just add something about, there was just recently, DEQ just issued a report that the Willamette Slough, which is, between Riverfront and Minto, was given not necessarily a great bill of health, but it was at least no more polluted than the rest of the Willamette River. So previously it did have some higher concentrations leaching from the previous industrial uses.
Got it. Good information. Okay, so there's another question that says, what code ideas currently support preserving riparian trees? We do have some existing code language in our zoning code that requires preservation of riparian native vegetation and riparian trees. So that's within 50 feet of any waterway. It could be potentially expanded or just strengthened to preserve more, I guess. So that's kind of what we have now, but that could be expanded. Will chariots help with disaster evacuations for people without cars? That's a great question. I think that this policy would sort of get at that element of coordination and plan making to ensure that things like that do get addressed. And we are working closely with chariots during this planning process to make sure that they're aware of what we're doing and understand the implications. So.
Greg, did you want to talk about your comment that you just put in the chat? Might be helpful for folks that are watching.
Sure. So I just put a comment in chat that as the request comes up, and we get this question fairly often, is chariots going to help us? And we regularly work with chariots for evacuations during flooding and other events. And anytime there's a need to move a lot of people quickly, we work with them regularly. They have an emergency management team that I'm well familiar with. And they are a great partner in response when things go sideways. So that is something that we already plan to coordinate with them, and they are already aware that this is part of our response. So the other comment there, that City Hall is going to fall down in the big one. The city, you're right, the City of Salem Civic Center is not seismically rated to a Cascadia type event, as most of the cities and infrastructure most of the infrastructure in the city is also not rated to a large event like that.
I see another comment about supporting trees and tree planting in low-income areas. That gets at environmental justice. That's great. For people who just joined, I got a comment about connecting to the polling. You can either use the link that Eunice just put in the chat, or you can text eKIM 847 to the number 22333 to join. Hopefully you can get connected.
Did you want to talk a little about the urban? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just looking at some of the chat. And so people have made comments about trees reduce the heat island effect in urban areas, supporting tree planting in low income areas are an environmental justice issue. And there was an agreement, and another comment, new trees should be distributed equitably. And so we are working on that. We've been focusing our tree planting efforts with, we hire Friends of Trees, and we also have our own urban forestry staff. And we also have another group that we're contracting with called Treecology that focuses on street trees. And we have focused all of those efforts as much as possible in Northeast Salem. I mean, we did do some tree planting in some of the other parks, kind of if there was an adjacent school often. But yes, we are focusing our efforts. We just have done several plantings in McKay, and we just finished one in Northgate, a second one in Northgate Park, as well as the surrounding neighborhood. So we are very much aware that that is a high priority for equitable tree planting.
Thanks, Patricia. The last comment I want to address before we move on is about creating safe bike trails. That was something that we definitely talked about during our parks policy meeting, and we had some policies about things like that during that meeting. So it's on our radar, and I appreciate that comment. So I think this is our last group of new ideas. They are about design and development, as well as the Willamette Greenway. So the first one about building design is about encouraging resource efficiency in buildings, new buildings. So that would be about making sure that we're using not only sustainable materials, but making sure that the buildings are energy efficient. And then the one about renewable energy is about promoting the use of renewables in private and public facilities, whether that's solar generation or potentially micro wind generation, things like that, to encourage more renewable energy production. And then the ones about the Willamette Greenway are about, the first one is vegetation and wildlife. So conserving our riparian area, specifically along the Willamette River Greenway. So that's conserving our vegetation and wildlife, and that includes in-stream vegetation and wildlife. So salmon and salmon habitat, things like that. And then the one about public access is about ensuring that we're including provisions for the public to access the Willamette River when development or redevelopment occurs. So if there's an existing property that gets developed, how do we ensure that there's an access point in those new development areas for folks to still get down to the river? So we'll jump to the poll on this one, and then I'll go back to those policy ideas. So there's a question about whether D is a state mandated provision of goal 15. Eunice, do you want to speak to that maybe?
It's part of the Greenway, yeah, and it's a policy that we currently have in our comprehensive plan. So for example, as we are proposing a new zone along the riverfront, we would include a provision, we're proposing to include a provision for public access as land develops. So yes, high level.
Got it. So I see a comment about homeless camps currently limiting Willamette River access in West Salem. That's certainly there are many issues that are all in play right now that the city is working hard to address. And yeah, I appreciate that. So there's a question about how the city of Salem directs building design without running afoul of building codes. That's a good question. There are things that we can do to incentivize rather than mandate. And so I think those mandates in our zoning code would be when we could run afoul of state level requirements, but incentives to do these sorts of things could be in addition to what's mandated. All right, just checking in on the voting here. I think for the sake of staying on track, we may keep moving on from this one. But definitely keeping an eye on the chat, and I appreciate all the comments that people are putting in there. All right, so we have a little bit of time for just general questions and comments about all of these previously drafted policies before we move on to some new ideas. Question about, is there language in goal 15 about public access already? Isn't that part of the intent? Yes, there is. I think both of those goal or policy ideas about the greenway are part of state requirements. So this would be, supporting that and potentially bolstering it. So, there are some things that the state requires, we could potentially go above and beyond as well. So a question about how these policies are prioritized versus housing development goals. I think as we mentioned, these goals do require some push and pull and some balancing of priorities and resources. And so I don't know that we would prioritize housing needs over environmental needs or vice versa, but we are planning to work on an implementation plan for this overall comprehensive plan once the plan is adopted. And so during that implementation process, we would look at what we can do in the near term and what might be a little bit longer term, and how we prioritize everything in that way. Can we limit expansion of new gas infrastructure in new development and replacing old gas infrastructure as quickly as possible? Thoughts?
Patricia?
So that is an idea that we have on our list of strategies for the climate action plan. It was not hugely popular in the survey that we did with the task force and with the public. I don't know if any of you took that survey, but it's still on the list and it is still up for discussion.
All right. So I think we can move on to some new ideas. And to do that, I think I'm turning it over to Patricia.
Okay, so some of these are going to overlap with some of the policies that we already just went through, but they maybe dig a little bit deeper into some of them. So, Austin, you want to go to the first one? Okay, so we don't have a specific policy about invasive species. So this would be one that says prevent or reduce the spread of invasive plants, and should say plants and animals probably, and support efforts to reduce the impacts of all invasive species. So this is a process that we already do internally, at least on our public land. We try to keep track of what kind of plants there are. There are definitely invasive plants that we're working on, such as the Ludwigia the water primrose that's kind of taken over the Willamette Slough. We're working right now with Willamette Riverkeeper to reduce that. So this would be having a specific policy related to keeping track of those invasive plants and animals and trying to manage those. So is this a new policy right for Salem? I also just wanted to add that we also depend a lot on the public to let us know if they spot different species. For instance, we had someone tell us about snapping turtles out at Minto. Those are considered an invasive species, as are red-eared sliders. They take habitat away from our native turtles. We also have, Japanese knotweed is a plant. We try to have people let us know if they spot that. It occurs often along our riparian areas, so we like to get, we'd like to have something where we have an early detection and rapid response kind of approach to invasive species.
All right, I think that looks like about everybody's voted. Should we keep going?
Yeah, looks like that was a popular one. Okay, the next idea is about habitat connectivity. So develop a habitat connectivity analysis and strategic action plan that identifies critical connections between green spaces and areas of natural habitat. So these would be essentially corridors for fish and wildlife, insects, plants, at-risk species. So often along our riparian areas, those tend to be really high quality, highly valuable connections for all different sorts of species. We're also looking at, for instance, in our monarch plan that we're doing is having patches of monarch nectar food as well as milkweed established in key areas that's within a certain distance so that the butterflies are able to access those easily and provide connectivity for them. So is a new policy about habitat connectivity right for Salem?
Patricia, we have a comment in chat that I thought you might want to address. It says, what about destruction of native plants like milkweed and protection of native species along riparian areas in the urban environment?
Well, let's see. So what about destruction of native plants like milkweed? So we're planting milkweed.
And protection, yes. I think they're specifically asking about riparian areas.
Yeah, so. I can see it now. So, and protection of native species along riparian areas. So as Austin mentioned, we do have a protection of riparian vegetation along our waterways. So that does not protect non-native plants such as blackberries or knotweed or things like that. Milkweed is not necessarily protected. In fact, farmers hate it, but we are planting it in our parks and in some display gardens around Civic Center, specifically for monarchs. Protection as a verb in a policy. Say, oh, I see. So you're talking about rewording it. And then someone said, yes, acorn woodpeckers and oak savanna. Yeah, that's a great connectivity habitat. I mean, oak and the acorn woodpecker as well as the white-breasted nuthatch. Those are highly linked. So a couple of people said no, it looks like, but most people said yes.
Should we keep rolling?
Keep rolling, I think. All right, the next one is related to community landscaping, and this has come up in the climate action plan as well. Encourage conversion of lawns for food production, pollinator habitats, and hardy drought-tolerant native plants. So this is related to food resiliency that has come up in the climate action plan. and the ability of more community gardens, more opportunity to grow food on your own property where you won't get afoul of regulations necessarily. Taking out lawn that takes a lot of care, water, herbicides, and replacing it with lower maintenance and possibly pollinator friendly type of habitats, and reducing the use of herbicides and pesticides as well. So is this right for Salem?
Patricia, there's a comment in the chat about HOA requirements that require watering lawns in the summer. Is that something that this could potentially address as well?
So I don't know if HOA requirements are, if those are just developed by each individual HOA and how the city can regulate those. Eunice, you have.
Yeah, we typically we don't regulate or enforce HOA requirements from the city.
That's interesting though, that they require watering lawns. You know, some cities have people put up signs where when they let their lawns go brown, you know, saying that the reason they're doing that is they're conserving water. What was the, I didn't see, I was looking at the chat. What was the results of this one, Austin, again? Sorry.
I think that person was asking to go back to the wording.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Someone made the comment of, you could start regulating HOAs. Why not?
I'm not sure that we can, because those are private agreements that happen. I'm not sure that we can.
And then another comment said that lawns require a lot more than just watering. Yes, indeed.
All right, can we keep going?
Yes. Okay. Climate change, adaptation, and resilience. Enhance the ability of waterways, urban forest, habitats, and wildlife to limit and adapt to the effects of climate change and natural disasters. So this also came up in the Climate Action Plan. And we've talked a lot about riparian habitats and the ability for those to be well vegetated and well, ideally forested. And so that helps to mitigate temperature and keep our streams cool, which is one of the effects of climate change that we will be experiencing. The other thing is to protect floodplains and floodways as much as possible. We have actually just acquired a small floodplain property just for that reason, to kind of keep that out of any kind of development and to make sure that the stream is allowed to meander or flood in that area as it needs to. So those are kind of some examples of what this means. I'm looking at some of the chats here while people are answering. Food production could include livestock, might be prudent to limit to plants, not against animals, just unsure of implications. Yes, and actually we do have that worded specifically to plants in the Climate Action Plan strategy. Yeah, I don't think we want necessarily livestock in the fronts and backs of people's yards in an urban area, although we do allow chickens, you know. And the city can certainly price summer irrigation water. That would encourage replacing lawns with other types of landscaping. The city could also tolerate residential landscapes that are mowed less often. Good points. And then Austin, you said, we do have a new draft idea addressing urban animals as well, but good point. Okay, so that one was also popular with the group. All right, what's next? Resilient urban forest. Encourage planting Pacific Northwest hardy and climate change resilient native trees and vegetation, especially in urban habitat corridors like the Willamette River Greenway. And I guess I would add kind of along all of our stream corridors as well. So one of the things that that we're looking at here and that we've already started to do for our street trees is we've updated our street tree list to include a broader variety of not just natives, but a broader variety of trees, so that if there is an infestation of like emerald ash borer gets here and we lose all our ash trees, that we are not going to be bereft of a huge component of our urban forest. So trying to diversify and also look at plants that are more tolerant of drought that might come from Southern Oregon or Northern California, and adding those to our list of potential plants.
And there's a comment about increasing our riparian areas to 100 feet as we continue developing on the edges. And I think that is something that we are going to start doing, at least for middle housing. It's a requirement under House Bill 2001 that we don't allow middle housing within 100 feet of our waterways. So that's a code amendment that we're working on and we'll hope to bring through the process this summer.
There was also a comment about, we kind of talked about the push and pull of some of these ideas, the idea of having greater density and also having bigger buffers. One person said you can't protect forests and expand residential in the urban area. These are contradicting ideas. Can someone speak to current city standards for street tree replacement, especially for weak trees? So our urban forester is actively inventorying all the damage that was caused by the ice storm. And then he's also very active in just inventorying street trees in general. If you have a specific street tree that you're talking about, then I would suggest you call Public Works and dispatch and tell them exactly what tree you're talking about. We are trying to get some just information based on the ice storm of whether there were certain types of trees that were more susceptible to damage or not. So that will be kind of interesting. So stay tuned for that.
Patricia, I see a question asking, what can we do to reduce or eliminate herbicide and pesticide use, especially in public areas?
Yeah, so we are actually working on our integrated pest management plan. And we've just kind of started that, but that will be looking at all of our city-owned properties and using an integrated pest management approach, which is to use herbicides and pesticides as a last resort and looking at other options first. And so that will help to reduce herbicides and pesticide use. And also we're looking at our parks and whether there's some areas that we can set off as no spray areas, or, that can become a little bit more pollinator friendly, might be a little bit rougher looking. They won't always look as nice to some people as a nicely mowed lawn, but kind of setting aside some areas where we do not have to highly maintain them.
Should we keep going?
Yes, I just was trying to see if there's any other things I need to address in the chat. Because it's going over to Greg here in just a second. Let me just see. I guess I'll just cover them in the chat so we can keep moving, and I'll turn it over to Greg Walsh, our emergency manager.
Patricia, if you want to address that one from Steve, you're more than welcome to. I think that's...
Anytime you introduce non-native species to an area, there are unintended ecological consequences, and suggest that you slow down here and look at improving habitat here so the ecosystem can adjust to climate change naturally. History teaches us this is a very dangerous policy. So I guess I'm wondering, Steve, if you can clarify when you say introduce non-native species, are you talking about when I mentioned that we were going to use possibly non-native trees for street trees. Is that what you're talking about? I guess
Well, I'm thinking along the greenway specifically. If in the city treescape, that's probably not a big issue, but the Willamette has been fairly resilient through history, and the biggest problems have been when somebody brings in a non-native species to an aquatic urban interface, and that tends to go dangerously. I mean, you can cite 5 or 6 examples across the country. So as far as the urbanscape, I think that's fine. We're doing it in homes and stuff. I wouldn't be too concerned about that, as far as you're very talented and very knowledgeable, so you can prevent, invasive species and other things like that. But in the greenway, I think there's a lot of room to improve the habitat in that greenway and redevelop that, support the native structure, and that forest will develop and change over time as climate changes. So I'm concerned if you start messing with a greenway, you're going to have some disasters.
Yeah, no, I don't think we were intending to do that. I think we wanted to get rid of invasive and replace them with native. And I think, Mike, I was maybe commenting that we might consider using some native plants that were from a different climate zone than Salem right now. Like, for instance, someone had suggested using black oaks more in this area. So we might just try experimenting with that, but they're still considered native to Oregon.
Yeah, but I mean, the white oak has been around for many years in Oregon, and I think particularly in Salem, the issue is that east slope streams coming off the Cascade have a different impact and different quality in terms of stream temperature versus a west slope coming through West Salem in that area. And there's been a lot of work at Oregon State in this area, but the two sides of the river are definitely different. They are different ecologies. There are different temperature profiles. And if you want to preserve trout species, lamprey, and other kinds of salmonids, you got to be very careful how you apply that policy. So I'm just saying, the warning signs go up when you start mentioning that.
Yeah, we want to, definitely not. I mean, one of the things I've noticed too is that sometimes the nurseries are selling invasive species, invasive grass species or something. So we definitely want to respect Mother Nature.
Right, definitely.
Thank you. All right, Greg, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you. So new ideas from other cities. This hazard awareness is something that we do already here in Salem. So it's not specifically a new idea. It's just the hopes and dreams of kind of expanding that. So increase the outreach and education for natural hazard awareness and disaster preparedness, especially for vulnerable populations. Now, I already do regular series, and we actually have one coming up of lunchtime discussions about hazard awareness and preparedness. That is quite literally part of my job as the emergency preparedness manager for the city. The hope and dream here is that we would just be able to get more support behind it and get more people involved and more people aware of the potential hazards that happen in and around, especially the city of Salem and our climate and our environment. So there's a new policy about hazard awareness and getting more people involved right for Salem. Okay. That's great. More work for me. In a great way. One of my favorite parts of my job is getting people aware of the potential hazards and making sure that they understand how to be prepared. For example, if you weren't prepared for the aftermath of the ice storm, the power outage, this is something that would help get people educated and trained for that, or for flooding, or for the potential earthquakes that we may face here in the future. And yes, definitely more Spanish language info, more focus on getting more people involved to hit some of those vulnerable populations, whether it's medically frail, different languages, whatever the case is. I've been actively working with the diversity inclusion team at the state for disabilities and different languages inclusion to make sure that as we do disaster and hazard preparedness, we are able to reach the entire population effectively.
I would just add that we also have a draft policy related to making sure that city provided materials are fully accessible. So that would include Spanish language and things like American Sign Language and other things like that. So.
Thanks. Okay, well, I don't see a lot going on in chat right now. And it looks like people are interested in more preparedness awareness. So this other one is natural hazard maps. So ensuring the city has natural hazard maps that stay up to date and reflect the best available science for a variety of hazards. Now we do have some great information for flooding. We have our flood team here in the city. We have there's an active program through Dogami, basically the state geology organization, Dogami, that is doing an active landslide survey of historic and recent landslides and doing assessments on some of that stuff. We do have clean streams, as Patricia put out. Unfortunately, there's some ongoing investigation into liquefaction. So for earthquakes and those potential hazards of what does the land underneath us look like for the potential of earthquake impacts, including liquefaction. And then wildfire and drought areas, right? There's already a large tracking program across Oregon for droughts. And it would just be the hope and dream here would be that we would get that more engaged in our mapping system. So if you think it's a good opportunity for us to take some more time and put more into our maps, this is a great time to tell us if you think so. Okay. Excellent. Well, it looks like for the most part, people are interested in having access to hazard mapping, which we already do have some basic hazard mapping, and this would just help us expand that and get more information out into the community. So,
Greg, we have a question in the chat about flood mapping staying up to date in order for the city to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program.
Yes.
Are all the other maps Dogami?
For the most part, a lot of the other maps will come from Dogami. And then we have some other organizations that help support them. But really, when it comes down to it, a lot of the state mapping programs is where we pull that accurate data from. It's very difficult for a city by itself to take on the complex, really work to do a really significant hazard for earthquake mapping without having support from county and state on that. That's, when they're talking about hundreds of hours of flying and ground assessments and landscape assessments with LiDAR. So for landslides, that gets very, very cost intuitive and requires a lot of effort and work. Fortunately, we have organizations in the state that are already doing that. So it will be helpful to continue to be engaged with them and have them give us map information. Now, we do have a flood map team that does flood mapping here in the city, as well as we use the FEMA flood map, but we do have that National Flood Insurance Program and our community rating system, which is available through our website here in the city. Make these maps mandatory for new property purchases. We do encourage people to check the maps before they purchase property. However, the property that's available is still within the urban growth boundaries, the property that we have to work with. The most up-to-date flood map, I'll pull a link for that here in a second and put it in.
Can you maybe tell us what Dogami stands for?
Sure. Dogami is, I believe it's the, it's
Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, I think.
So yeah, thank you, Patricia. Yeah, that's correct. Department of Geological and Mineral Industries. So they have a lot of great mapping capabilities. When other homes are shaking off their foundations, we'll be living in tents like the homeless. How many weeks will it likely be? So when we talk about preparedness and disasters, including the Cascadia subductions of an earthquake, we really talk about 2 weeks ready. So everybody really should be prepared to be on their own for at least 2 weeks before they'll receive any help from the federal, state, or military. That's just a really realistic assessment that it will be months to years for some of our infrastructure to be improved. When we talk about bridges, overpasses, water systems, sewer systems, power, internet, self-service, all of that is likely, when we talk about a Cascadia event, all of that is out the window. We will very likely be going from a first world country to a third world country in 7 minutes or less. And that's a pretty significant concern. That's why I spend a lot of my time talking to people about being prepared and being at least 2 weeks ready, having food, water, and shelter prepared, and then getting that information into the community really is one of the hardest things. How long is it likely to be, though? I mean, depending on where you live and the type of land that you live on and what type of house you live in, or what structure, apartment, brick building versus stick frame, if you're on a slope, if you're on a flat spot, there's quite a bit that goes into that assessment, but it is pretty likely that most of the population will have difficulty with immediate reoccupation of their homes. It may be a few weeks before you can actually get back into your home and use it as shelter. So planning for that appropriately is very part of the key message that I try to get out to people. How does flood mapping accommodate the development in East Salem, low-lying farmland, but now built up pads for development? We do know that a lot of that land is former riverbed, and that the liquefaction factor is a huge potential there. But that is unfortunately just part of the way Oregon is. There's a lot of the area that is former riverbed and has different ground values. So flooding mapping will have to be included in that. And then maybe a property value implications related to hazard mapping. Non-mandatory mapping tends to make people nervous. That is correct. We were not required to update our flood maps, but we did. And that was part of our community rating system to try to get a better rating on it. So people do often get scared when we show new maps of updated data, but that is part of we have to learn, we have to keep going, and we can't just rely completely on old data. So looks like we're on to the questions and comments and new ideas. Thank you.
We just wanted to leave space for any other ideas or topics we didn't touch on that are related to natural resources, the environment. There's a lot in the chat, so I apologize if we didn't get to it all. Is there anything anyone else wants to add? I did see some comments earlier about not developing to the edges of our urban growth boundary. Our urban growth boundary is the boundary within which urban development is expected in the future, again, to protect farm and forest land on the outside. And to the extent that we can introduce more complete neighborhoods as that land develops, the more walkable those areas can be. So they aren't car dependent, as was put in the chat. So we are trying to propose some mixed use areas and some neighborhood hubs and some other shops and kind of service commercial areas in areas that we expect to see further residential development, so that everyone doesn't have to kind of go downtown, or everyone doesn't have to go to Commercial Street or Lancaster. But I don't think we can just ban building from happening within the urban growth boundary. We can shape how that happens, or how the development happens. There are clearly issues with competing policies. How do we help impact the outcome of those conflicts? Sure. So as I think Austin mentioned, we are going to be putting together an implementation plan as part of this project that's going to help us prioritize what actions we take when. And so our consultant team is going to help us put that together. So if you have any comments about what you think should be first, second, third, what those steps and actions should be, feel free to reach out to me and let me know. As we shape that, we will provide that to the community. Steve, you have your hand raised?
A couple points. Maybe Patricia can think more about this, but I know that the idea of the parks, the linear parks and that kind of thing, there's a psychological benefit to everybody for having that kind of green space in the community. Have we thought about another kind of Wallace Marine Park or Bushes Park, or Central Park idea for Salem? I mean, does that make sense, or does it make sense better to stay with, pocket parks, linear parks, and these connections based on our, where we are? I don't know the answer to that. And then another quick question for Eunice on these neighborhood hubs. I've talked with you a little bit about it, but does it make sense to maybe emphasize our transportation system in terms of, better transportation to and from shopping centers, that kind of idea, to cut down on emissions in communities. And there's a real issue with diesel and fine particulate now in human health, and the issue of having deliveries to some of these places into neighborhoods. I mean, does it make sense to maybe minimize that idea and provide a transportation system so we're better linked as a community, and let the different parts of the city develop and then link us up by just being able to get on a transportation system? So I'll just leave those two. But Patricia, I was just interested in your idea in terms of how the natural landscape is best designed for Salem, given, I mean, putting a central park in may not work, but what do you think in terms of more green space strategically located in Salem?
Yeah, well, in our comprehensive park system master plan, we have identified different types of parks in different parts of the city, so that we try to have an equitable distribution of from the large urban parks, which I think you're referring to kind of as the central park idea, or down to, we're going to probably get down to pocket parks size in the next iteration of the plan. It's hard to find large chunks of property in the city. We did acquire 45 acres in Northeast Salem recently in the last couple of years, which is a big chunk of property for us to acquire. The next, then if you know of any large pieces of property that we should look at, we'd be happy to look into those. I think probably, I think the future is also going to really need the smaller parks that are tucked in vacant lots, in between buildings. And then the linear parks you mentioned are really important because they can connect people to all these other infrastructure we've been talking about. And they're going to be a great trail system has been very popular. So I think that we're going to have to look at all options.
Thank you.
Looks like there's a comment here about Marion County. So we do get there when they do make land use decisions within the area that could be eventually part of the city. We do get an opportunity to weigh in on those land use applications, and we do. And we're coordinating higher level on the comprehensive plan with them. But in terms of what's happening outside the urban growth boundary, I'm not sure that we weigh in on that. Unless it's at the legislative level and we're weighing in on a bill. But typically, if it's not in our jurisdiction, we haven't been weighing in. Let's see what other comments there are here. As we have a housing shortage, especially affordable housing, let's be careful not to restrict available housing. Just move forward. Housing in the future that will just push people to the suburbs and have the commuting into Salem for their employment. And then there's another comment. Does Marion County have a plan for Goal 14 urbanization? That's a good question. I think that they actually just eliminated the urbanization section of their comprehensive plan. I would defer to Marion County on that, Sadie. Okay, let me scroll up. Who controls, how is the UGB changed and who controls it? Changing the urban growth boundary is a big lift. There's a lot of things you have to do, and the first step really is whether or not you can justify the need for it in terms of your future population and your future, your housing and your employment needs. We've done those baseline studies, and we have enough land within our urban growth boundary to meet our needs over the next 20 years. We just need to redesignate land to meet those needs. So that's why you'll see on our proposed zoning map, you'll see a lot of changes to multifamily housing, for example, because we know we don't have enough multifamily land. So we don't anticipate a change to urban growth boundary in the near future. Austin, can you help me go through some of these questions?
Sure.
I feel like they're whizzing by.
Maybe we should get through the rest of this presentation and then we can jump back to questions at the end.
Okay, sounds good. So just kind of to let you know what's happening next, we are doing outreach, continuing to do outreach on these policy ideas through both a survey, community meetings, and these weekly policy meetings. So we will be using all of that information with the help from our consultant team to revise our policies and add to our policies and present that back to the community. We do hope to adopt all of the policies with the rest of the comprehensive plan by the end of the year, or at least start the adoption process by the end of the year going forward. So this is just our project website. We're constantly updating this information on the website, so please check it to see kind of where we are and new opportunities to provide input. This is we do have our policy survey online. That's in English and in Spanish, and those are the buttons. And then aside from policies, we're working a lot on our map. So we launched a new interactive zoning map that shows proposed changes to zoning throughout the community. We launched that last week, and there's an opportunity that you can drop a pin and provide comments. A lot of folks have done that already, and that's what I was saying earlier. We are going to have our Wednesday meeting on May 19th focus on answering questions related to that map. And then in addition, we have a zoning subcommittee that is made up of counselors and planning commissioners that are looking at code changes to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that's kind of where the overlap of the climate action plan in our Salem is also happening. So we're looking at things like our parking requirements, our heights, our minimum densities, requirements, for example, for neighborhood hubs. So we're doing a lot of that coordination. And a lot of that discussion is happening at the zoning subcommittee. The public's invited to attend those and to comment and to submit written comments. And that's going to be, next meeting is May 27th from 12 to 2. So you can find all the information on the project website. That's just my name and contact information. If you have questions or think of things later, feel free to circle back. Okay, that was really quick. I know there's other questions in the chat. Please answer Jim's questions. Many of these policies talk about carbon sequestration and how will our Salem prevent G issues? What was Jim's question?
You want me to read questions and then maybe you can answer them?
And just real quick, Eunice and Austin, I want to just give you a big shout out and thank you and say to everyone, we had Eunice and Austin come to the West Salem Neighborhood Association and Edgewater Partners, and that was very, very helpful to getting the community involved. So please ask them to come. They're very helpful and it is very good. So I just say thank you both for the outreach that you did in West Salem.
No problem. Yes, we're happy to come to any meetings that you have of a different community organization or even just neighbors getting together. We're happy to come chat. Okay, so is this the only session that's going to deal with the climate emergency and the council's goals and how to address our Salem? Could we have a separate meeting on this? Yeah, I will talk with Patricia and see, how we can, better, I guess, have a meeting potentially, or what our plan is going forward and making sure that we're coordinating and there's an opportunity for the community to continue giving input. So let me chat with Patricia and we will all circle back. Are there other questions, Austin?
Yeah. Could we potentially require large lots in areas far from shopping or jobs, like a minimum of 1 or 5 acre lots?
I think technically we could, but I think that what we're trying to do is make sure that as we grow those areas that develop on the edges, because there is developable land on the edges that is meant to be urbanized, that we are trying to create more complete neighborhoods. If we create a lot of 5 acre lots, for example, then that is not necessarily making those areas walkable. It's going to push people further away from services and shops and almost push them towards having to get into their car to access shops and services. And so what we're trying to do is introduce, again, neighborhood hubs, small scale shops and services in those areas, as well as larger mixed use areas that are pedestrian oriented and that provides that kind of amenities even on the edges.
I think it would also affect our ability to meet our housing needs.
And it could potentially drive up the cost of housing. We know that housing affordability is a major issue in the city, and we're trying to tackle it on all fronts. And so if anything, we've heard a push from the community to allow for smaller lots or infill or more units on lots like House Bill 2001 is going to require us to do.
There's a question about what the theory and reality of the urban growth boundary mechanism is. Is it a strict limit on urban sprawl?
Mm-hmm.
One that's regularly adjusted? So maybe a little bit more about what it is, what it does.
Sure. So it is an actual boundary that where we are trying to, again, contain urban development inside that boundary so that we are preserving the farm and forest land on the outside. So that's kind of the theory behind it. In practice, we don't regulate land on the outside. We're trying to ensure that all the housing and jobs that we need in our 20-year forecast in our future can be met within that boundary. And so when we talked earlier about needing more multifamily land, for example, that's because that we're trying to make sure that the land inside that boundary is available for people who want to live here, want to work here, or move here. So in theory, no, we don't. I mean, in practice, no. We have done those studies to say that we don't need to expand our urban growth boundary in the near future. It is a long process if we were to do it. Some communities have taken over a decade and millions of dollars to try to expand their urban growth boundary. But the first step, again, would be justifying that we need that land.
There's a question that asks, does Marion County have to plan for goal 14 about urbanization?
Yeah, that one we addressed. That's okay. It's time for small steps in the right direction is long gone.
Here's one that suggests maybe annexing everything within the UGB now, so Marion County leaves us with the ability to make land use changes and decisions.
Yeah, the city, we haven't gotten any sort of direction from the city council that there's a desire right now to annex all of that land. The conversation does come up from time to time over the years. Back in, I think it was the early 2000s, maybe we did do a study to see if we were to annex those big pockets in Marion County, if it would be a financial plus or minus to the city in terms of the services and the cost of providing those services. And my understanding that is that report said it would be a negative to the city. But that does come up from time to time. I'm not aware of any plans right now for the city to annex those properties. People will tend to want to move up. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
There was one about just a comment saying that a lot of these policies are about either carbon sequestration or mitigation. How do we make sure that we're preventing greenhouse gas emissions, not just mitigating? So that's just a comment that I wanted to highlight, I guess.
And then there's a comment, please remember that people tend to want to move up in housing, MFH, multifamily housing, will generate needs for single family housing? And yes, we have also heard that there's, the idea of maybe smaller homes that would be more affordable. And again, kind of that infill idea. So I appreciate that comment. We are trying to plan for both multifamily housing and our single family housing needs. Did I miss anything? I know we're right up at 1:30, but there's any other questions or comments, let us know. Sorry, Austin, didn't mean to cut you off.
No worries, I think we're caught up.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank you all for coming, Patricia, Austin, Jennifer, Greg, Glenn. We will be talking about what's next week, public and community facilities. And then tonight, if you want to come back, if you want to talk more about this, we will be here at 5:30. Oh, and there's another question about, I'm just going to answer this last question. There's a question about a functional bus system in Salem, similar to what Eugene has. And Chariots was at our transportation meeting, and they are doing they're going to start a long range plan of their own. And so we will be coordinating with them to see kind of how we can best link up our land use plans for the future as with transit. So I appreciate that comment. I think we're out of time. Thank you so much. My contact information there is on the screen. Please do check back the project website. Again, we're updating it almost every day, every other day, weekly. So check back. Thank you.